Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video I'll be discussing Kings of the Wyld by Nicholas Eames. And before I get completely started, I just want to preface this with, I typically like to go into books blind, that way I don't have any expectations, and this was definitely a book that I had heard just so much about, and I'd heard a lot of good things. Among others, Daniel Green has talked about this quite a lot on his channel, and it just sounded right up my alley between the kind of the style, the humor, the 80s rock and metal references. Just absolutely, I was expecting to love this book, and because I went in with pretty high expectations, this was a pretty disappointing experience overall. And don't get me wrong, this book is not in any way bad. It's a good book, but for me, it definitely didn't reach the threshold of great. And in the book, there were actually several comments about what makes a story great versus just good throughout, and so I thought it was a little ironic that for me, this story definitely did not hit that great threshold, and it just seemed that those elements that really make a story great were definitely missing for me. Before I get into the details, I once again want to reiterate, this was a good book. I'm not saying that it was bad. The ending, for one, was fantastic, and that did a lot to kind of make the rest of it worth it for me. But like I kind of started with, I had a pretty lukewarm reaction to the beginning and middle sections of the book, and so I'm going to talk about those, and there are quite a few negatives, there are positives too, but I just want to once again note that I'm not saying I hated this book, despite what I'm about to talk about the negatives with. So with that, let's talk more about what Kings of the Wyld is about, and what the things I liked and did not like about it. So Kings of the Wyld follows a legendary mercenary band called Saga, who decide to come out of retirement for one last tour. Now, the core concept of this book is, in fact, that mercenary bands are essentially treated like rock bands and rock stars, and that kind of concept mixing in the, 80s rock type metal and all kinds of different music references throughout, I really liked it. It's actually one of the things that drew me to this book, and I think that part of it did work really well. There's a lot of the kind of the jokes, the references, the things hidden in there, and I really enjoyed that part of it. However, the first big problem I had with Kings of the Wyld was the pacing. This book is almost 500 pages long, and to be honest, it seems like it could have told the same story in literally half that. We spend the first couple hundred pages just trying to get the band back together, and then it's quite a few more pages after that that we finally even get to the Heartwyld, the big forest with all the monsters that we've heard so much about. And it just spent so long getting set up and getting started that it felt like the ending and a lot of the action scenes were really just kind of rushed. And I feel like cutting a ton out of the beginning, a little bit out of the middle, and allowing a little bit more time for the end, and then just, cutting out a couple hundred pages in general would have really helped this book for me, because it really did just move pretty slowly for the most part. The other big problem I had was the overall tone of the story. It really seemed like Eames couldn't decide if he wanted just an over-the-top parody or if he wanted a dark, gritty fantasy. And Kings of the Wyld kind of toes the line between the two while not really exceeding at either, in my opinion. It just kind of came down to, if I'm supposed to take the story seriously with kind of the dark and the gritty parts and feel tension, then I can't exactly look over some of the plot holes and some of the issues here. And if it's just supposed to be a parody, then constantly trying to make it serious doesn't really work that part either. And it just makes the serious part seem like they're trying too hard, and so that's kind of where I was, just stuck in the middle for so much of this book. This book definitely does have fun parts, but I just really struggled to feel any sort of tension when half the action scenes just kind of fade to black and you don't actually get to see what happens, you just see the aftermath. You have serious injuries that are just kind of ignored or magically healed all of a sudden. And as an author, you can't keep trying to tell me as a reader that I'm supposed to care about these characters and that they're potentially in danger, while at the same time making it exceedingly obvious that nothing is going to happen to these characters and they are absolutely going to be fine. And whatever they need to move on in the story is going to happen because plot. And that just seemed to happen quite a lot. There were so many storylines where things just happened to go their way, or there were interactions with other characters where they just happen to be given the information that they're going to need later on. And with doing that, for a serious story, that is going to make it bad. For a pure parody, I could accept that, but once again, that kind of sitting in the middle just was detrimental to the story for me. Now, the characters, I have to say, were really, really well done. And I think that's what a lot of people really liked about this book. You know, you kind of have the lovable rogues, and their interactions with each other are a lot of fun to read. Most of the characters, I think, were a little bit more one-dimensional or just kind of following an archetype. But I actually don't think that's a bad thing, because part of the whole concept, once again, is these are supposed to be more like iconic rock stars than just original fantasy heroes, and so you kind of already know the type, and rolling off what you already know, what you think, it makes kind of you develop the characters in your head even more going along with that idea. So I didn't really think that was a bad part. The characters were a lot of fun, and they could have been a lot more detailed, but I think it worked the way it was. The one character that really seemed to get the most development, I guess, per se, would be the main character, Clay Cooper. But with him, his kind of backstory that was slowly revealed over time, at least to me, was really, really obvious from the very first time it was mentioned. So those later reveals didn't really add a whole lot, but for me, like I said, it was more so the interactions between the characters that did the most development and were the most fun to read, just kind of with the witty banter going back and forth. And of course, I really did enjoy the music references. That was a huge part of why I thought this was going to be a book that I was going to love. And even though I definitely didn't love the book, it was an overall fun read. And some of the references in there are really, really obvious. Some are a lot less obvious. I'm sure there's somebody who's compiled kind of every music reference there somewhere on the internet. But it was just kind of fun reading through. And you don't, even if you miss a lot of them, it's not a big deal. But the ones you get, you'll be like, oh, I see what you did there, Nicholas Eames. And it just kind of adds that extra layer. And without getting into spoilers, like I kind of teased before, the ending is really what sold this book for me. The ending really brought the action, the kind of classic rock star type moments, really all the things that I was looking for finally came toward the end, and it was a really enjoyable, action-packed, and yet also extremely fun ending. And because Nicholas Eames stuck the landing, that's why this is still a somewhat positive review. I really think it'd be different if he didn't, just because, as I kind of pointed out, I had a lot of issues with the story overall, but the ending really pulled me in and definitely kept me with an overall net positive experience. So overall, like I said, this is a good book. It definitely wasn't up to great for me, and I think part of that may have been my expectations. Had I read this without knowing anything about it, would I have enjoyed it more? That's definitely possible, and maybe even likely, but it just kind of, with reading it with a very high expectations, it did not reach that mark. For me, I have kept in mind with reading this and in the review, this is Nicholas Eames' first published book, so hopefully some of those things were just kind of new author struggles, and will be better in the next book, Bloody Rose. I do plan to read Bloody Rose, but based on my reception of this book, it's definitely getting moved back on my TBR, so probably won't be particularly soon, but at some point in 2021, I will most certainly get to it and read it. So with that, that is my review of Kings of the Wyld. I have a feeling most people are going to disagree with me just because, like I said, I've not really seen a whole lot of anyone with anything negative to say about this book. But, you know, I give my honest opinion with the reviews, and I always am going to say what I think, even if that's not the popular choice. So that is my review. If you did like the video, then feel free to give it a like, and if you want to see more of my content, then feel free to subscribe.